a very interesting character, and he seems to have been a kind of factotum, a kind of jack of all trades, who carried out perhaps all of Elizabeth's dirty work.
Fitzco and the old ladies were not only responsible for the day-to-day running of the castle at Chachtiche, but also the recruitment of girls from the outlying villages to work as Elizabeth's servants.
It's hard for us to imagine that anyone would willingly go and work in a household if there had been rumours of even one girl dying, but the situation for many people in Hungary at that time was so desperate. The only way to guarantee a living wage would be to virtually sell your children into servitude in the great house, and that's exactly what happened.
At the tower, the girls were undressed and showered down, and then she would look at them and she'd pick out the ones that she wanted to torture. If somebody was too skinny and too pale, she didn't like them at all because they didn't last very long under the torture. She liked the buxom ones, the big ones, because they lasted longer.
Trivial offences were punished in the most extreme ways. One girl from the village beneath the castle was accused of stealing money from the household coffers. It was claimed at her trial that Elizabeth heated a coin over a candle until it was white hot, then pressed it into the girl's hand. Elizabeth didn't confine her particular brand of domestic discipline to Hungary. On several occasions during her life, she was in Vienna to visit the court of the Austrian king, Matthias. Despite protests, she tortured servant girls here at her house in Augustinerstrasse.
And we have the accounts of the monks from the Augustiner monastery across the street. They heard the noises of these girls, the torture sounds. So they threw their pots against the windows. But there was nothing they could do about it, because she was a powerful woman.
These scenarios were repeated at several of her castles, including this one at Lockenhaus on the Austrian border, a fortress belonging to her husband's family, the Nadastis.
I don't think that they would have seen a distinction right up to the point of near death between disciplining and acting sadistically. They didn't have those distinctions.
Excessive cruelty on the part of Hungarians to their lessers, the Slovaks, was very common at the time. In this case, she carried it too far. I think she had a compulsion to torture and eventually to kill.
There's been a need throughout our cultural history to have great mythical icons of female evil. Elizabeth Bathory, in due course, was taken up to represent this figure. The bloodiness of her myth and the bloodiness of the events ascribed to her are typical of medieval and post-medieval European imagination.
Even the birth of her own children, the last of 4 appearing in 1598, seems to have done little to foster any sympathy for her servant girl.
I think that's what makes her doubly shocking. She seems to have been a caring, loving mother type to her own children, who of course were Hungarians, obviously, and not Slovak. The traditional view of the woman is kind of violated when you have somebody, especially who's torturing young girls.
this abuse of her Slovak peasants would become markedly more extreme. The catalyst for this was the death of her husband in 1604.
As soon as a woman was widowed, all her family and all her neighbours and all the other competing families would be after her to strip her of that wealth by legal means or by simply occupying her lands, defrauding her, accusing her perhaps of false crimes in order to take away her property. And there was no way that a woman could resist this, even a woman as powerful as Elizabeth.
Suddenly, Elizabeth's vast estates were threatened. Feeling vulnerable, she reacted as only she could.
You discipline, you over-discipline. It's a very logical way to react if you feel that things are getting out of control. Disciplining becomes cruelty, becomes abuse.
At Chachtiche, one of her few remaining castles, that abuse would escalate to the point where Elizabeth Bathory would become a mass murderer. By 1604, the now widowed Elizabeth Bathory, a powerful and wealthy Hungarian countess, had for years been cruelly torturing her female servants at her mountaintop castle at Chachtiche, in what is now modern Slovakia. Her sadistic reputation was beginning to strike fear into the hearts of all who heard her name.
You must imagine these people cowering outside the walls of her castle, never knowing what exactly is going on in there, but knowing at the same time that they are absolutely subject to this person's power, to this person's whims.
Before her husband's death, Elizabeth had been abusing her servants in order to discipline them. This eventually escalated to murder. According to the documents from her trial in 1611, it was estimated that she killed almost 650 young girls.
There are two reasons for what she did. One of them has to do with her own mindset. She thought she was just disciplining her servants. But the other has to do with just getting old and jealousy about the beauty of these girls. She's in her 40s when she was fading. Elizabeth Bathory was very obsessed with her own looks. She used to have a mirror, and she would spend hours looking at herself in that mirror. She had that narcissistic fascination with herself and her fading beauty.
Elizabeth's obsession with her fading youth manifested itself in bizarre ways. According to evidence given at her trial, witnesses claimed that Elizabeth cannibalized her servant girls.
At one point, and we have the testimony of several witnesses, she got angry at one of her maids, and she rose up like a bulldog, it says in this document, and she tore the flesh from the shoulders of this girl and bit her breast.
She may have eaten young women's flesh in an attempt to incorporate their youth within her.
Somehow in her mind, apparently, she thought if she ingested parts of these girls, maybe she could acquire some of their youthful beauty. So technically speaking, what we're dealing with here is you are what you eat.
Cannibalized, sexually assaulted, tortured, and beaten to death, the bodies began to pile up at Chachtiche.
And after a while, mile, and they were running up into the hundreds. She was running out of space. She kept some of the bodies of these girls under her bed, and the place really started to stink.
To cover up, Elizabeth and her 4 senior servants claimed that the girls' deaths were due to disease or accident. And to substantiate this, Elizabeth would bully the local clergy into giving the girls a standard Catholic burial.
Some of them were just thrown in ditches, and eventually one of her cohorts got rid of the bodies, and they simply buried them further and further away.
The testimonies given against Elizabeth Bathory make endless references to how the servant girls died, but one aspect of the evidence is dominant: her association with blood.
Elizabeth had this fixation on blood because there are accounts which are verified in the court record of her having to change her blouse because it got so blood-soaked.
In later, sensationalized versions of her story, it was claimed that the Blood Countess actually bathed in and drank the blood of her victims. These legends, which place Elizabeth Bathory at the center of the vampire myths, are less shocking than what really occurred.
What she would do is she'd have these girls up in cages, and then she had a long lance, and she would pierce them, and the blood would come down and flow on her, and then she would shout obscenities, apparently.
Elizabeth Bathory might have gone on killing with impunity forever, but the year 1610 marked the beginning of her end.
She made a big mistake. As long as she dealt with Slovak peasants, nobody cared. That's a fact. She could have gotten away with it. She went after the daughter of a local Protestant minister. Big mistake. Because this girl escaped and told the story about what was going on up there in the castle. When news came to the Hungarian nobles, well, they couldn't tolerate that. One of their own, you know? That was her critical error.
Ironically, Elizabeth's nemesis was a relative of hers, Count Georgi Thurzo, ruler of estates near the town of Bichka, to the northeast of Chachtiche. What's clear is that Thurzo wasn't acting out of a sense of moral outrage. He wanted Elizabeth's land.
Elizabeth was the only one whose court in Chachtice was the rival to his court in Bicha. However much he had fellow feeling for her as a fellow aristocrat, as a fellow Hungarian, he would see her as an obstacle to his ambition.
But Thurzo had to act quickly.
He had to keep the Austrian emperor at a distance because the Austrians wanted Elizabeth's land and wealth as much as Thurzo himself.
On the bitterly cold night of December 29, 1610, Thurzo led a party of soldiers into Chachtiche Castle. In a letter to his wife, he described what he found when he entered.
We directly came then upon certain men and female servants in the manor house. We found a dead girl there. A second one was dead too, from a number of wounds. I wait here until the accursed woman has been deposited in the fortress and a suitable room found for her.
Other accounts have it that Thurzo actually found Elizabeth in the process of beating a servant girl called Doritza to death, as punishment for stealing a pear. On January the 2nd, 1611, only 4 days after her arrest, Thurzo convened a court at Bichka.
Thurzo was very clever. He didn't put her on trial. He put her servants on trial.
what we call the hors d'oeuvre strategy. You know, you throw them the little fish so they don't go for the big one.
Elena Yo and Dorothea were convicted. Their punishment for having used their hands to torture and murder was to have their fingers torn off with a pair of pincers. Still alive, they were then thrown onto a fire. Fitzko was spared the pincers, but was decapitated instead. Only Carter escaped the death sentence. Her fate is unknown. By the order of Count Thurzo, Elizabeth Bathory was still under arrest at her castle at Chechchiche.
Well, I think he was still deciding whether he could get away with trying her or not. And in the end, perhaps he decided it was better just to let her rot, which is what happened.
Elizabeth's sentence was publicly announced by Thurzo. Lifelong imprisonment in one room at her castle in Chechchiche. Elizabeth Bathory's lands were confiscated and divided up among various Hungarian nobles. Thurzo had triumphed. Her imprisonment would last for 3 years. In late August 1614, the bloody Countess was found lying face down on the floor of this same room, dead at 54.